Jeffrey, our faculty member. A very good evening to our special guests from the other side of the world in the United States. So before we go on, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Zahid, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. And first of all, we'd like to thank David and Marina for accepting our invitation to give this architectural talk. It's a huge privilege to us because to have you guys on our humble virtual platform, and it's a very rare opportunity to have international architects to give a talk to our student body. And we believe that in this COVID-19 era, online session is the new norm, right? So hence we like to utilize it to its fullest potential in our pursuit of education and online learning. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us for today and giving us a talk. And before I go on further, I'd like to remind everyone while the session is going on to turn off their microphone to avoid any disturbance or any technical difficulties during the session. So before that, I just want to start off by giving a brief introduction of our guests, David and Marina. So they are the founders of the famed architects firm, a California-based luxury architecture and interior design office in the United States. So we have David Bruce Lee, and he's a registered architect in California and New York. And he graduated from one of the highest ranked architecture schools in the United States. Sorry if I butchered this David. Is it Cal Poly San Luis Obispo?
That's right? Totally correct.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Spanish is up for you.
And he focuses on the client relationships and conceptual and exterior design. So as for Marina, she is a registered architect in New York and a lead green associate. She is trained in sculpting, painting, and art history at the, pardon my French, École des. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. She graduated from the French National School of Architecture in Paris, and she studied design at one of America's leading architecture universities. And she focuses on consultant relationships, interior design, and construction administration. And I just want to notify this to everyone joining us today that they have established a online podcast. They talk about architectural stuff, well, in terms of education, in terms of practice, and I've been listening to them for quite some time. And I believe that you guys can listen to them in your own time. And it's a really interesting podcast. And I think you guys should join it. Okay, so without wasting more time, I'd like to pass the mic to David and Marina to start off their talk. Thank you.
Great. Well, first, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really exciting and interesting to be able to connect with people from across the world. And thanks for the introduction. That's a very gracious introduction. Should I share my screen probably?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes,
okay,
please.
here we go.
Yeah.
That would make sense. The presentation, well, I'd rather call it a conversation that we have for you today. We have some slides. It's just text. It's mostly for us to have kind of a reference as we speak. As you probably already know, we have kind of scheduled an hour for this part of the conversation, and then another hour afterwards for question and answers, which we hope to be just a conversation between all of us. That'd be great. So if there's anything that we don't fully cover in the talk, then just ask us afterwards and we'll do our best to answer the questions. Okay.
Yeah, will do.
Can you see the screen?
It's not. Yeah, sure. Yeah,
there we go. It's coming through.
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So when Orlando first reached out, shout out to him. There was kind of an interest in design process, and so Marina and I it was actually a good question because it forced us to kind of think about what does that mean for us, which you don't often do in practice because you're so busy with things. So this is the presentation that we came up with, or the conversation. There are, let's see if we can switch over. There we go. So this kind of dialogue is going to have 4 parts to it. The first is we're going to talk about just project types, very basic introduction things. and then design process and how it relates to the project types. And then the third chapter, which is the bulk of the talk, will be about process, tests, and strategies, design, tests, and strategies, and then some closing remarks. I know that we have a fair number of people here that are in the middle of thesis, so we try to be mindful of that, but also there's some things in here that are for general students as well. So for the project types, it occurred to us that there are three categories that we can kind of talk about. The first would be an unbuilt thesis, which is what a lot of you are doing currently, in the sense that it likely will not be built. The other one is unbuilt typical, which would be any standard student project, we could say, or even competition projects a lot of times. And the third category would be built works, where you're obviously involved with a client and you're working closely with the client. The difference, these three types are important to understand, I think, even as a student, because when you have a client or don't have a client, that radically changes a lot of the variables you have to deal with, right? So I would say that between these different project types, the relationship between the architect or the designer, let's say, the architect, the client, and the concept is different for each. And the biggest difference, obviously, is that when you're working with a client, is you have to respond to them and report to them. So in a way that for us, understanding the client is really just as important as understanding the site and the program, which are probably two components you're all familiar with. It becomes very different, though, when we work on a house for someone. Like, our ability to read that individual is just as important as us being able to properly analyze a site.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have like an unbuilt project or like thesis project, you don't necessarily have that client present. So you kind of have to either play the client and make up, you know, what a client would say. And that's a very different exercise, because you don't have anyone that, you know, like sends things back to you and reacts to the things you have to say or the things you're thinking of, right? You have to be able to play on both sides of the court. So it's very, very, very different.
And so actually, that's for students, you have to realize that actually that's more challenging in a sense. Like, when we go to design something in the real world, we have real constraints to deal with. And in a way, it makes it easier because those constraints are there. As a student, though, you're having to kind of think from both sides. But for the purpose of this conversation, we're mostly going to focus on non-client-based projects because, well, that's what you do after school. We can talk about the Q&A if you want. So I think one way to perceive the design process as kind of like, it's really problem solving at its core. And it's all about understanding the different variables, much like a math problem. So in a math problem, you have the given variables. We call them givens in the States. I don't know what you call them there, but the given information that's forced upon you, and you have to work with that, right? And again, it's kind of like in the real world, between the zoning code, the building code, the schedule, the budget, and the client, and the real site, all of those are beginning to outline, not a design, but they're starting to kind of sketch a very murky image, right? And it's going to kind of tell you potentially what direction you can and should go in.
But at the same time, you can't let that drive the design process too much. And oftentimes when you look at, you know, actual build project, some offices would only respond to these variables. And that's when the project comes out like a little dry, you know, like you kind of lost the magic because it just strictly responded to these parameters. So you have to be mindful of them, but you don't necessarily have to only follow them or respect them, right? Like, the goal is to kind of challenge them, especially in the thesis project.
So I think this understanding of the variables and rules that you have is really important, because it means, as a student, again, that you need, a thesis student especially, you need to kind of force these fixed givens or variables on yourself, but at the same time push against them. And at least for me, when I was in thesis, that was a real struggle, because you have probably the most freedom during thesis as compared to previous years. And even in previous years as a student, you're given a site, a program, and et cetera, but you're meant to kind of question it. And of course, it's a studio setting, so we're suspending disbelief for certain things, right? But at some point, when you allow everything to be whatever you want it to be, it's really, really hard to design. So that understanding of variables as a kind of from a detached perspective, I think is really important.
And the role playing is super important because, especially during your thesis project, that's what's probably going to be the closest to what a client and architect's relationship will be, right? That's why you really have to be willing and honest to play that role. Otherwise, you're just going in the direction you want to be going, right?
Yeah.
You need someone to kind of counteract and counterbalance the direction or the decisions you're taking. So you have to play client and you have to play designers when you do a project.
I think how this all shapes the design process, we've talked about a little bit, but in particular with thesis, it's kind of a weird thing because you essentially are coming up with a thesis first, in a way, or the beginnings of one, right? And so you have an idea, an argument, or the beginning of one, you do research, and after that, you select, in some cases, you select all the typical stuff, the site, the building program, things like this, because you select them as a way to express the thesis that you're trying to resolve. And if you think about that for a moment, that's actually quite backwards in many cases, because in most cases, right, in a studio setting, a teacher gives you the project stuff, and then you begin work. In thesis, you have these inner ideas that you're trying to resolve, and that's informing the building you end up kind of working on. And that, again, I think is something to be aware of because it's much more challenging. Now, the strange thing is that all of us, because we are people and human beings, we have our own biases and our own kind of beliefs and own perspectives, which is to say that, in fact, every person, even a younger designer, has their own, probably multiple theses within them that they're trying to resolve. So what that means is that when you come to a project, right, a standard project, and you're coming kind of naked to it, you're seeing the site for the first time, you're getting the program for the first time, you are still bringing with you your own biases and your own beliefs, right? Your underdeveloped theses. And so in the end, thesis is actually really important and kind of are always surrounded by it, even if we're not aware of it, because we come from a certain perspective, right?
Yeah, and I think that's when the thesis here is kind of helping revealing those things to you. Like you might have developed them during your previous years in school, but really it should come very strongly and apparent to you and clearly during fifth year, like basically where your interests are in the realm of architecture, design, and all of those big topics. There is things that are going to be your kind of your core value as a designer, like the things you would never give up on any projects. And the thesis project is kind of, like the thing that's going to reveal them, and it should. Really.
Yeah, right. Okay, moving right along to design process. I think for myself, research is a big part of this. And research is kind of, I think, understood by designers sometimes as being separate from design. You do research and then you design.
And that's why I feel like, like oftentimes, like David teaches or like we go to reviews, students don't fully understand the importance of research. It's kind of like, okay, it's the homework, it's what the teacher is asking for. Let's satisfy him, pull some maps from Google Maps, do some diagrams, and be happy. I can move on to actually the fun part, which is designing. And hey, that's a big boo-boo, especially in fifth year, especially in thesis. Like research that's what the gold is. You're like digging for gold, right? You can't skim over research. At least that's how we've always been doing it.
Yeah, and I think that people have a tendency to think of research as this dry thing, but if you do research correctly, it's actually quite conceptual. So going back to the idea that design is basically problem solving, you could even further argue that really most of what design is trying to figure out what the problem is in other words, it's trying to ask the right question, right? Because if you ask the right question, which is not easy to get to, it's not easy to find, the answer will be revealed actually very, very clearly very often. So this process of research isn't just about absorbing information, it's about formulating it into a story and trying to dig deeper to find what that core question is. Another way to look at it, again, as we've said on the podcast, is thinking about research from the perspective of like a journalist or a writer or a detective. If I'm a journalist for a newspaper and I go out and I do my research, what am I trying to do? Well, in the beginning, I don't know what I'm doing exactly. I don't know the information, but I start, and my job is to connect the dots between all of this miscellaneous information, which at the beginning seems like it's not related, it's not interesting, there's no story. But it's your job then as a journalist to, again, see the hierarchy, find out which are the big characters, the main characters, and how they all relate. The same thing applies to when you're doing research for a design, right? You're not just accumulating facts, you're trying to figure out what that question is and what the story is.
And I feel like, oftentimes when research has been really well done, like you did a very good job at doing research for the project, actually that will bring like the core identity to your project, to your design. It make it like it was designed for this site and only this site. Sometimes you see buildings and they could be anywhere, it wouldn't really matter. Like it doesn't feel like it came from where it's at. And really, truly, I think it's because the research phase was just like, not being taken care of properly.
And there is something about this part of the process where, how do I know if I'm doing it right? I think it's when you start to, like something else is revealed and you become excited, which is something we'll say later on as well.
It's when you discover the gold.
Like what makes a good news article in the newspaper? Well, the facts all need to be correct, right? The research needs to be sound. It needs to be clear that the different characters and how they're involved make sense, and it needs to be coherent. So I think research is a big part of it, and again, asking the question why, and what is the big issue at hand. Moving on, I think in terms of process, sometimes too, like in school, it's taught that you design a certain way, and in terms of education, it makes sense because you have to start somewhere. So let's say, for example, I'm in a studio and I've been kind of taught that, okay, you always start with site first, and then you do bubble diagrams, which are, you probably know what they are, but they're diagrams like kind of like circles with different words of program, and you kind of arrange them, and then you move forward to making rooms, and that becomes 3D, and et cetera, et cetera. As a way of learning, I'm totally fine with that. But I think for the two of us, and for me in particular, I don't think that there's any particular step-by-step process which makes sense.
I think that's like a process that maybe is good as an initiation to understanding what architecture is and like the overall design process. But when you're much further advanced into, like your schooling, this is almost like, architecture 101 or architecture for dummies, right? Let's put it this way. No, really, it's like the basic stuff, but it's kind of the safest path, right? Like you're not talented, like you could do that and eventually it could work out. But if you're trying to really produce quality architecture and design and meaning, you gotta pass to the next level.
The issue with, if you always constrain yourself, let's say for the rest of your design career, by this, whatever process you've made, is that it tends to be then your thinking becomes, okay, I know step one is, call it bubble diagrams. I've done my bubble diagram, now I move to step two, and et cetera. So your thinking becomes limited to whatever that one step is. And I think another big aspect of research and design is staying very light-footed, being able to move around between different ideas and different things. Again, much like the journalist, right? He doesn't start, his process is not like step 1, 2, 3, and 4. He's light on his feet. He's trying to figure out really what the story is. And it tends to be that if you design in a very restrictive sense, you're just excluding ideas that I think should be filtering into the process. But there is a sense of direction with the process. And for the simple reason that we're going from nothing to something, we have to finish the project. Hopefully we finish it. So there's a sense of direction because of that. And there's a sense of direction because we are looking for conceptual clarity. In the beginning, the idea of concepts, the idea of ideas, it's all quite confusing, but we know in the end we want it to be clear.
And when we say sense of direction, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the direction that the design is going to go through, right? You're like out of research or still a foot in it, and you are starting to play with the design process. So there is multiple directions. You don't know yet which one exactly your project is going to take. And I think as a student, you have to be okay with that. You know, a lot of students sometimes kind of get paralyzed because they don't have the directions. They don't know what they want to design. It's totally fine. Like, you need a time for experimentation and testing out, and just like feel like you have time to play around.
Which brings us to the final point of this chapter, let's call it, is designing as testing. Because we don't have a step-by-step process to follow, I think that it's helpful to think of the design process as basically just a bunch of tests. The tests don't come in a particular order necessarily, but there are tests. And I think this is useful, one, because through these tests, it's an easier way to figure out if this thing is good or bad, which is a really big question. And then the second, too, is that it prevents you from getting stuck. Stuck in the sense, as I said before, that you're becoming too reductive in your thinking and you're excluding ideas. And stuck in the idea that you have writer's block, designer's block, like you just don't know what to do next.
And it's good to test because, again, like if you jump on that one direction you came up with and you move like way, way far into it, like in the time that you have left in your year, right? And then halfway through, you're like, hey, damn it, I made the wrong decision here. Like I should, now I have to backtrack and redo all that work again. That's why the testing portion is super important. You have to just give yourself, and offices do that, before you go on into presenting a fully designed building to a client. You're going to experiment. You're going to have 1, 2, 3 design iteration. You're going to play around with the concepts, Going to see what works and what doesn't.
Yeah. And that goes back again to the idea of being very light, right? You're never really fully commit to anything, and which is a very frustrating way to move through the world. But also, I think it's how you incorporate new ideas, even so much that the project might be complete, and you're still going to think about it, right? There's projects that we've done in the past. It's been years and years. I still think about it. I'm like, I don't know. Maybe something else was there.
It will haunt you for the rest of your life, probably.
So then moving on to the main part of this talk, which is the tests themselves, the design process, tests, and strategies, which is, again, answers to one of the questions of knowing whether or not something is good, which is actually a central one, because if you knew the answer to that, then you'd be able to move forward quite easily. I think there's like 6 different ones that we outline.
There is like 6 big points that we always look at whenever we design a project, and it's probably points that are very common to most architects, I would think.
Yeah, the first one is perhaps the most obvious, which is a media test, which is to say that you should use all your tools. So if you're stuck with something, just produce that thing with the different medias you have at your disposal. Physical models, writing. Architects and designers really, really underuse writing. Writing is very important for working through conceptual ideas, because writing doesn't allow you to lie to yourself. The issue with designers is that because we are avid lovers of beauty, form, shape, shadow, material, that's all great. But there has to be clear conceptual meaning and logic behind it. And when you write something down, if it doesn't make sense, it's pretty clear when it doesn't make sense. So this computer stuff, talking to your peers, or even just thinking or collaging, this is like rudimentary stuff, but it's so often that we speak to professionals all the time, and one big issue is like working between the computer versus hand sketching. This is like a debate or a dialogue that's happening. And one of the most consistent narratives we hear is that when I'm stuck on something, we talk to these people, they say, when I'm stuck on something, I realize it's because I've been fussing in the computer for 3 hours, and then I go to sketch, and the solution's revealed within 5 minutes, 30 seconds even. And it's because someone should have told them, partway through that 3-hour computer phase, just move to something else, right? Don't keep going down the same path if you're not feeling productive. And we've all been there. When it's not working, it's time to switch gears. The second test which is a favorite of mine, is in different levels of abstraction. So blur and focus is one way to think about it. Another way is to say that you have this part of the design, this thing. You basically draw, or however you decide to communicate it, you draw it either more abstractly or less abstractly, more realistically and more detailed, or more as a diagram. And this is where diagramming is very important, because it gets to the essence of whatever that thing is, and it reveals a different perspective about that thing.
And sometimes trying to make a very simple diagram very clear and very sharp takes a lot of thinking, and that thinking helps you clarifying thoughts and clearing them and like putting hierarchy on them, you know.
So those two should be pretty straightforward for your thesis students. This is the next one that's kind of interesting, is that there's different architectural criteria through which we could critique a building. Now, this list of 6 is not meant to be like the only 6. It's not the 6 commandments, but roughly these are the things we know about, right? Relationship to site, like how does it relate to the site? Program, the function of the building, right? Its relationship to culture and people, the technical integrity of the building, that would include its structural integrity. 5 would be sustainability, very important now. Has always been important, but we just realized it recently. And then beauty, of course, which would include all the stuff I mentioned before, like form, space, light, material, etc. Now, I think it's worthwhile to kind of see these 6 things, because I think in one way, again, we can understand a building through each of these lenses and rate the building 1 to 10, right? I look at a project, and these are the 6 categories. I'm going to mark you, on relation to the site, you got a 10, program, you got maybe like a 5. Now, I think this is helpful for us to see the big picture, right? Even though I would say these 6 criteria are architectural truths and they have to be addressed, that does not mean that during the design process that you should be equally concerned about all of them.
Because it's too much.
Because it's too much, and it doesn't make sense. Don't think that you have to be a 10 out of 10 in all categories during the process. If you think that way, you will very likely fail, unless you're Frank Lloyd Wright, who sketched falling water in a matter of hours. Unless you're him, it's not going to work. And
those are not also necessarily things that need to be tackled at the same time. Some of those topics will come in later in the process if they're not, on the top hierarchy list of what your project is about.
The other issue is that if you try and force these 6 things on your project, you're gonna, and let's say you do manage to satisfy all 6, I can guarantee you that whatever you produce is gonna be really stale, banal, and boring. There will not be any soul or character, right? And the reason why that we want soul and character is because, again, we're trying to tell a story. These 6 things, they don't care about story, right? They have no sense of hierarchy, no sense of flow, no sense of poetry. So if you force this checklist on what you're doing, that's the wrong way. That's the back end. You're working from the back end. You want to work from the story end, right?
And if you think of, I don't know, maybe what's the building that moved you the most, that you've seen and you visited in your, in your life, it won't be because that building got a 10 on all of those categories. It's because of the magic, the experience, what it makes you feel like, the things that are kind of hard to qualify and quantify, right? And this is truly what you're aiming for. Those are kind of just ways to get there, but they're not the way.
Another way to think about it is in terms of writing a speech. Now, I'm sure in terms of writing a speech, there are probably the equivalent 6 categories. Now, there are people who do write speeches based on the 6 categories. And any easy example would be if you consider some CEO of some generic conglomerate. We've all heard a speech by a person like this, right? It hits all the marks. Yet at the end of it, you're like, well, this is...
It's soulless.
There's no person behind this, right? They're dead behind the eyes. The same thing would apply to your design. So even though in the end, in terms of performance, hitting these 6 points is important, you have to realize that they're not all equally conceptually important for the story that you're trying to tell. So like another common example that we see with a lot of projects, a flaw with a lot of projects is that a student, right, has been told by someone, you need to address sustainability in your project. And meanwhile, the student is trying to tell a story that's not quite about sustainability. And in the next review, the student has a green roof. And the green roof now solves sustainability for them.
Student projects or even, firm
real
projects.
Ones.
Like you see how many sustainable towers you see out there where they just plug in the vegetated balcony and like, just like spread like greenery all over the building and they hear it's sustainable. No, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, because again, you should look for ways. So after you feel comfortable with the design direction that you're going, and you have these outliers, these categories that you haven't fully addressed, you should address them, but they have to be addressed in the way that makes sense for your project to, again, further the design, the concept, the story that you're telling, and not just shove in a green roof because it's an easy fix.
It's like if you have, let's say, a costume for a movie, you're not going to reuse the same dress that was used on another movie, right? You're going to create the one that makes sense for your movie and your character and your story. It's the same thing. It's a process of appropriation for that specific project in a way that it brings meaning to it.
I would also probably argue that for thesis, which is probably the even more conceptual in a way, that you don't even have to address all of these things if it's not related to your thesis. And that's
you don't have to address them, but I think you should be aware of them.
Sure.
You can't be like, oh no, I didn't know about it, or I'm ignoring it. You have to have a position about
you have to
it.
acknowledge
Right.
whether or not it's included. Yeah. Also, we had written down this example of a shark skeleton, just as like an idea or like a design project to work with, because I think like architects these days, the biomimicry in terms of form has been made popular. And so, the shark skeleton idea, you could use these 6 criteria and it would fall apart in various ways, you would assume. But the last point with this slide is that just because your idea, the thing that you're working on, let's say the shark skeleton, doesn't work in certain ways, does not mean you should throw it out. I think sometimes we have a tendency to kick out ideas because they don't solve something for us when they should. But it could be that the shark skeleton initially, as we've conceived it, right, it doesn't work in terms of program because of its form, or doesn't work in terms of, I don't know, sustainability or something. Well, it could be that, in fact, our preconception of what the shark skeleton's value was incorrect. That the shark skeleton's value is not to do with form or structural integrity or efficiency, but had to do with something more conceptual, right? So there's potentially portions of the thing that you're currently working on that are valid. They just need to be understood from a different perspective. Okay. Do you want to do this one?
Yeah, sometimes you are in the design process and you get stuck. And when you get stuck, what do you do, right? Well, you have multiple options. You can fast forward, so you have an idea, you're not sure. Yep. Why don't you just push it 1 or 2 steps further? Try and develop it like quickly, like a charrette. Like just work on it a little bit and see like what could come out of that idea. And that would give you a sense of, okay, well, this is a pass, this is a no-go. Like, what can I do with that?
Yeah, the design process, there's a lot of trial and error. And I think sometimes, especially if we're under a deadline, we have a thinking that, again, we're just going to go step by step and we're going to get there. And there's a refusal to, like, and in each step it needs to be good. But so the previous 3 points were all about understanding this thing from different perspectives, right? To break loose and to learn something from it. The same thing applies to basically fast forwarding time, right? If you could be Doctor Strange and go in the future and see how this thing develops, you'd be like, oh, well, clearly this was like a bad idea, or clearly this was a great idea. So there's a kind of a little bit of suspending disbelief. So even if you have something and you know that there's some core issues with it, and you're like, I know it's not going to work, it's a lot of times worthwhile just to go forward. Just to go forward and then come back if you need to. Because I think we also need to realize that when we produce something, there's we don't always understand the thing we produce. So there's a kind of a distance between my understanding of the thing and what the thing actually is. In some cases, I have an idea and I draw the idea and it's exactly how I imagine it to be. Other times I draw the thing or I produce the thing. It takes me 10 minutes to really understand it. Other times it takes me a month, sometimes it takes years. And what that all means is that there is a natural gap between this object and my understanding. So it's perfectly okay, temporarily, to include things in the project that you don't fully understand, because later on you're going to circle back to it to try and understand it better.
At the same time, you have to remember that you're just testing, and that you might have to reject some ideas. Like you might also just jump on the one that seems to work, right? And a lot of times, especially students, I feel, there is always that fear to not have a project, not finish on time, being behind, with my other classmates, and they got it, I don't have one. Well, it's human nature to seek for securities and answers, as soon as you have an answer, but it doesn't mean that it's the right one. So that's why developing forward and testing is super important.
As is going backwards, like you said, like we were speaking with, and listeners of the show would know this, we spoke with Anne Fougeron, who's a really well-known architect here in San Francisco, California. And we've spoken to a number of other professionals and designers. And another commonality is that when they're working and they're stuck, they realize that they're stuck because they messed something up a few steps backwards, right? Whatever those steps means. It could be that the previous development, the concept was followed or whatever. So in addition to moving forward, it's a lot of times helpful just to take a few steps back and see, maybe I started down the wrong path, which is why I'm where I'm at now. And if you're still, find yourself struggling, then you might have to go back to even research and throw in more ingredients into the mix, right? It could be that you're struggling because you actually need more information to work with.
If you're struggling, or if you're just thinking that what you came up with is really just not that great, you might have missed something somewhere that was actually much more important, and you didn't look at things closely enough, and it's okay to go back.
Okay, so this is the most conceptual one, obviously. It's the conceptual sequence of a project, which is basically asking the question, why am I doing this? Why is it this way? And then asking again, well, why is it that way? Why did you do this? Why did you do this? And here's an example. So for my thesis, I had, as any of you probably, certain kind of ideas or inclinations, beginnings of something, but I didn't know what the thing was. And it ended up that I produced an urban design project that involved reshaping the grid of Manhattan and proposing a new way of moving around in the city, a new transportation system in the city. I did not start the year or the project thinking I'm going to change the grid of Manhattan. And I liked smart cars because that's interesting and that's the future.
And you like Elon Musk.
And I like it. This is I did not start that way. But nevertheless, this is a very quickly typed kind of conceptual sequence, as I call it, for the project I've worked on. And it's, if you notice in the upper left, it starts with the most basic thing of, because I want to help people. And if you don't have that in common with me, you probably shouldn't be a designer. Well, okay, so again, it's a question of why? Because I want to help people, because I don't feel like they are as fulfilled as they could be. Why? Because we are too detached from our cities, right? Why? Because digital life and physical experiences are separate. Why? Because the contemporary city experience is being fragmented by digital experiences, by iPhone experiences. Why? Why is that? Why do we allow that? It's because our environments actually do not foster engagement, whereas digital environments do, and because our environments are rigid. Why? Because the built environment is incredibly monotonous, in particular Manhattan in this case, and because our movements as people in the city are monotonous. Why is that? Because the urban framework is fixed, it doesn't ever change, and because it's a perfect grid. And also because we have sacrificed a huge portion of the design of our cities to this automobile. because the automobile was not designed for the city. That's the problem, right? Furthermore, it's large, polluting, fast, and dangerous. Why did we allow that? Because we prioritize efficiency and speed over quality and experience. Now, there's probably a cleaner way to write all that out, but the sequence there should be pretty clear, and the step from one to the next should make sense, right?
It's like moving with a magnifier, right? You're refining and refining and refining your argument, your question, your position, right?
Yes, and this conceptual sequence will not become clear day one. It won't become clear halfway through. It'll start to become clear. It might not become clear until the very end, and in some cases, depending on how organized you are, it might not become clear until many years later. But this is generally the direction that we're trying to move forward in, right? And so I also like to discuss that there are ways to know if your logic, which is the paragraph I put up there, is flawed, the conceptual sequence tests. The first is that if your why statement is too broad or too vague, right? For example, I ask a student or whoever, a designer of this project, why did you do this? I want to help people. That's too broad. It's too vague. That's step one, right? That if that's your only argument and it doesn't lead to somewhere else, it's totally not helpful, right? Like if you think about it in a way, the gap from I want to help people because I'm a good person, right? And people are not as fulfilled as they could be. The gap from that all the way to I'm going to invent a new transportation system is pretty huge, right? Now, there are many different ways that you could go from the root feeling of I want to help people, but still the lineage should be tight. The other is that if the statement you have is much too specific, for example, well, self-driving cars are the future or they're sustainable. Again, that's not tied to a deeper meaning and therefore is really without any kind of rationale.
No, and it's almost more like, you're pushing your interest, your agenda,
right?
Where really you're not seeking the thesis, like you already know what you want the solution to be, which is not really the right way to start research or a project in general.
The third is that in each of these sentences, you should not have giant gaps between them or giant leaps. Like it doesn't make sense for me to say, I want to help people, so now I have a new transportation system for Manhattan. That's too big of a gap, right? There needs to be tightness between all these steps. The reason why that's really important is that when these different sentences are really tight next to each other, the how, because this is all why territory, like why, the how will become very, very clear. Right after reading this thing, it's like, okay, well, probably we need to change some of the rigidity, allow people to move in a different way.
It's being able to go through this series of why questions really makes your argument and your position even stronger. And in an argumentation or a presentation to a client or a jury, it's like your argument is so like concrete, strong that it's almost indestructible. Nobody can go against it because you're proving that you figured it out completely. And
this is not really a test necessarily, but I think the question of what a concept is comes up a lot, and it's a difficult one. It's a difficult question, or it's a good question. A concept is when you find an idea that basically is consistent throughout all of these different layers. So in the case of this project that I'm kind of outlining, where there was a new urban grid and there's a new transportation system, the concept at its core was fluidity and hybridity, the mixing of things and the fluidness of things. This was the one consistent idea that solved all the issues that I was confronted with. And I think when you have that, that is truly the concept. The fifth one, and the final for this, is that the thing you produce should be expressive of the why statements, the things that I have up on the screen. If the final building or whatever the project is, urban design, building, interior design, doesn't matter, it's all the same. If it's not expressive in some way of this conceptual thinking, then something's wrong. Because again, if these statements are clear and they're tight, the next step, the how, which is probably the program and some other things like this, becomes very clear. And then therefore the what, which is the final product, is also outlined really, really clearly. Okay. Finally, this is the last one of this grouping, and
it might be painful. Thesis is often painful. It's to be expected, but it should be exciting. Like, you shouldn't be bored. You shouldn't feel it like someone else is pushing thesis on you. Like, it is for you. It is a very, very strong and very important step in building yourself as a future professional architect. And that's something that you're probably going to realize once you start working. You know, you're going to realize that, yeah, you know, like everything that I've been doing in fifth year, like, was exactly the things I'm strongly interested in and who I am as an architect and all of those things. So you really should use those projects and those years to really think about it as a work on yourself indirectly, like not as like, oh, this is all about me. Not really. It's indirectly about you, and you should be aware of that.
I think all that's true. I think also the thing that you produce or in the process of producing for any design project, it should make you excited and you should feel like you're learning from it. So if you produce this thing and you don't feel like you've learned from that thing, like the thing you produce should make you question it, really. If it doesn't, then you've done something wrong. Then your answer is probably based on a preconception that you had before and you haven't questioned deep enough. In an odd way, the object, even though you're the creator of this object, the object should teach you something. That's the big thing. If the object is teaching you something, and when you look at it, you're learning, that's a good mark that you're probably in the right direction. And again, if not, then you need to go back, I think. So all of these tests, you know, I think for me, anytime I'm stuck or I'm working through something, I'll just lay down one of these different things, obviously talk to my partner about it. And through each of them, something about the artifact, the object, the building, something will be revealed to me. I will see it in a new way. I will realize that either that this thing is tied to a different idea, a bigger idea, or something else. But it's when, again, when the thing stops teaching you something, when that object is not teaching you something, then that's when you need to shift gears. Some final closing remarks. We blasted through this pretty quickly. Is for the thesis students and actually non-thesis students, is going back to that idea that we all have our own biases and our own ideas. And as Marina said, thesis is a chance, an opportunity for all of you to learn about yourselves. And that is an idea or a concept that I don't know if I would have understood when I did thesis, but it's really important because the awareness of self, I believe, is a necessary thing in order for you to design something good and understand how you did it. The danger is that if you don't understand yourself and you don't understand, therefore, let's say your process as well, you produce something and you're blind to your own biases, which you can't afford to be, since architecture is a huge social responsibility. So, as I said in the very beginning, there are certain ideas that we all have, and it's perfectly fine for us to use projects as a way to see through those ideas, right? This is why architects or artists even, their work a lot of times looks the same because they're wrestling with one or two ideas throughout all of their projects, right? That's fine, but you need to be aware of how much you're going to force your own questions onto the thing versus letting the thing dictate what's going to happen.
And that's where honesty, I think, is one of the most important quality in design, the design process, and during thesis. If you're honest with yourself, if you're honest with the project, you don't try to push things on it. You just kind of like try to understand it to respond to its best. Mm-hmm. It's really when, to me, you know, the most successful projects is when you feel like there's someone who really was behind the project and understood it the right way and looked at it the right way and didn't just, you know, force on an aesthetic or a structure or a gesture, right?
And I think even for young designers who are not at thesis yet, it's important to ask these questions and be aware of it. Because again, there are patterns that you will see in your own work. And of course, that requires you having produced enough work to see patterns. But just the more that you can see them clearly, the more you realize that you are allowing yourself to color the solution. And it's really when you have a good understanding of that and you mix it properly with the specificities of the site, the project specific stuff, that's when I think you can create something really great. And that's it. Thank you.
And have fun.
Oh, have fun. Yeah, well,
no, but
it should be a struggle.
I remember my thesis year, I took this thing so seriously at the beginning with the research, and the site was massive, the program was massive, and I got paralyzed at some point. And then, one day you realize, hey, guess what? That's the last project I'm going to do in school. It's discovery, it's playground. You gotta have fun.
Yeah.
So don't forget to have fun.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, you're totally right. I think the end game is trying to have fun during the whole process, right? And then if you're not having fun, then what's the point of doing the project?
And by thinking like that, also that for me personally, it unlocked my actual design process of my thesis work. I felt like I was paralyzed in this system, and I just created my own way to work and my own system and find the tool that were right for me, and it really helped me a lot.
Yeah.
So I know we have a bunch of time left for any questions and things like this. I will say that we blasted through that about 10 minutes faster than I thought we were going to. So I hope that it all came through. If not, then just ask us questions and we can go through it at a slower pace.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I think most of us have a lot of questions that we have a compilation of questions from all the students and all the people that are joining us today. But before we go into that, before we start our Q&A session, I just want to invite our lecturer, Mr. Jeffrey, because I believe that he has some few words to say. Mr. Jeffrey.
Yeah, thank you, Ahmad Zahid. I almost forgot to talk today. Anyway, welcome David, Nelly, even though I'm late, but and Marina as well. Thank you for willingness to teach our students. I know this is very, very tough for them. I always advise them that be patient and enjoy. Like you said on the last statement that you mentioned just now. Have fun, I always mention to them, have fun, not to be too stressed. But anyway, thank you, David and Marina, for the insightful, very beneficial insight. I hope that the students get some other opinion from others part of the world in the world, so that they too believe what I say. Sometimes I wonder whether they understand my statement or not, my direction or not. But I think what you said just now is similarly what I taught in class, and even some of the key words that you mentioned just now have a similarity in our teaching method. Anyway, anyhow, thank you very much, David and Marina. Again, I think I continue. Well, you guys can continue with your Q&A and pass back to Zahid. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thanks for
much.
having us.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffrey. Yeah, like Mr. Jeffrey said, I think everything that you mentioned is the things that we feel right now, actually, because we just don't know how to put into words. That's a problem, because we understand all the things that you mentioned about the process, the asking why question. Is it the steps that we have to go through, and doesn't mean that you need to fulfill every requirement. So I think all of us are going through right now, and then I think all of us have some questions on that matter, and it's great that we see a different perspective on the process, like you mentioned, that you guys mentioned. Okay, I think we can move into a Q&A session right now. So we'll try to compile as much as questions. If anyone has a question, they can post in the chat box or just volunteer, ask their questions right away. So is there any question out there?
Okay, Mr. David, I want to ask you something.
Yep.
Because you mentioned that when the student is trying to tell his own story, we shouldn't push on, for example, sustainability. But don't you think that, for example, if we say sustainability is about having, for example, good indoor quality and good natural lighting inside the building, don't you think that no matter what your story is, it is essential to have a good natural lighting, or it's essential to have a good indoor quality? So this is something that no matter what's the story that you're trying to tell, but these things are a must. No, what do you think? Because this is what you say that we shouldn't push that in the student, but I see that essential for good architecture.
Yeah, I agree. You are correct. And the profession in general has been very slow on this, and it's really unfortunate. And if we're going to survive as a human race, we need to make some serious changes. So the gravity of being efficient in the building and having healthy environments it cannot be understated. And so I think a clarification in case it wasn't clear. So all of the 6 categories that we put up there, all of them are important. We should have all of those things, of course. And one could argue sustainability is in fact the most important thing. That's fine. In terms of again, critiquing a building and when it's done, it should do all those things. But it tends to be that during the design process for anybody, but especially a younger designer, you become, what's the word? Frozen. You become stuck, right? Because you're trying to solve too many things at once. So going back to actually what the previous person said is, it's because you're not addressing sustainability at, I don't know, a third of the way through the process or even midway through, it doesn't mean that you as a designer are saying it's not important, and it doesn't mean that you're not going to address it. It's more like, you need to have a really strong spine to the project, the core. The core of the project needs to be there. It needs to be really clear, which is basically the very essence of the story in a way. Then you can begin to address all the other issues that you have to address, but you just haven't been able to do it yet, right? It's like, here's another tip in terms of designing, which you guys would probably understand, is that when you start to design something, it's generally better to start simple, right? If you start with trying to solve 20 things, it's impossible. You start simple. You start simple knowing that this simple idea, this simple sketch is going to have to grow and evolve to address these different things. But you can't, again, be forcing all the different factors throughout the entire process.
And it could be that air quality and good lighting and the sustainable aspect of the project are embedded in it, but it might not be the story of your project. Of course, those things have to be treated. Of course, your building will have a structure. Of course, your building will have windows. Doesn't mean that that's the main story. That's the key concept of your project. Makes sense.
I don't know, does that make sense, kind of?
Yeah. So maybe I start imagining there are, even in sustainability, there are essential things, and there are things that maybe you can consider it as added value, maybe green roof or these things. If you use these things, maybe it's just like how you said, your sustainability. But then the essential things, it cannot be avoided.
Yeah, and I think also the things that we just said is really much more on the conceptual end of the spectrum, right? Because we're talking about having a story through design and things like this. I think we should also acknowledge that when it comes to practice, when you're actually designing real buildings, there's a lot of ways to solve efficiency and health problems or sustainable problems, right? In non-conceptual ways. Just putting your windows on the right side of the building and using the right materials. Those things, as an example, right, they might not be conceptually related to the project in any way. Right? There's nothing like for my project, which is about, I'll make up some, what would my project be about? I don't know. A Peter Zumthor thing, whatever. And my project is about form and beauty and sculpture and ceramics, right? That's the idea behind it, whatever. That's the conceptual spine of it, and that's what's going to dictate a lot of it. But again, because of technology, essentially, we're able to solve the sustainable issue and not have to worry about, it having a perfect conceptual relation to the project, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, thank you for the question, Amar. I think we can move on to the next question. We have another question from Amza from the chat box. Hi, can you share your insights on the conception of virtual architecture, not to be mistaken for the virtual architectural visualization, yet the concept of building architectural infrastructure in the virtual realm, where most of our activities are transitioning into online classes, online shopping. So what do you have any take on that?
Oh wow, that's a good question.
Yeah, yeah, it is a big question.
Well, so is it more in the sense of like more like user interface, user experience, or
Well, if let me know if I'm wrong about this, but I think the person's interested in virtual architecture, but not they're not wanting to talk about virtual reality in terms of architectural representation. They're actually talking about true virtual architecture where people will experience things in that space.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yeah.
Do you want to go?
no?
Okay. Yeah,
That's
actually,
a very interesting question. You know.
Actually, I have a lot of thoughts on this, and not to plug the show more, but if you really want to go down a weird rabbit hole into my brain, we did an episode. What? No, the one that I did, the in-between state, called. I called it something, I don't remember, like augmented realities or something like this, and essentially it was a presentation more or less of a paper and a project that I did after I graduated, which interestingly originally came from my thesis. But anyway, this other project and paper was called the in-between state, and in it I talk about basically virtual realities and I compare them to physical ones and the pros and cons, and I speculate a new reality where they're hybridized. I think with virtual realities, there's obviously, I won't go through the whole thing now, but the key points are there's clearly benefits compared to the physical world. The benefits are that, well, this is a good example, and we're all talking right now. We can work out in pajamas. We can talk to people in Malaysia or in California. So there's a speed and efficiency and immediacy with virtual realities, which bends time and space, which allows for new opportunities. Probably the biggest problem, though, with these spaces is that they're only really authored by a handful of people, because the knowledge it takes to create a reality like that is very, very rare in reality. And as such, it becomes an issue of restriction and a restriction of freedom. When I go to a restaurant in the physical world, I'll go there to eat. And now, because of Yelp, I have an idea of how that experience is going to go. I know roughly what kind of food is going to be there. I know the price. I know the kind of experience. I know the kind of people, right? However, in the physical world, it's still subject to a lot of things. Crazy things can happen in a restaurant. There can be food fights, marriages, proposals, anything and everything between, right? That openness is crucial because it is forcing us to contend and be aware of new things every day. The problem is, if you take that example and you apply that to Facebook, let's say, you say Facebook is an experience. Everything that we experience on Facebook is highly structured. The physical restaurant has seats and tables. It's telling us you should behave this way. We don't have to behave that way. We could do whatever we want. In Facebook structure, in virtual reality, if it says you can only use this chat box and put an X number of words, that's it. There's no workaround. So Facebook and these virtual architectures are like the most extreme prisons in a sense, because whatever behavior you want to do is fully defined by their architecture. Whereas the architecture we create in the physical world, again, open to a lot of different behaviors, beliefs, and activities. Not the case when it's virtual, because once you're in it, that's it. You can't distort the grid of Instagram. You can't use Instagram in ways that it doesn't intend you to. The rules it defines is total and absolute. The rules we define as architects, loose.
And the access to it too. I mean, not everybody can access those virtual spaces, right? Only a third of the population might, and the rest is kicked out. That's probably the biggest key point. And the other is that very quickly, when it comes to cities and people, public space is the #1 component. That's what defines a city. It's the most important element.
And public space is essentially when you have a bunch of people who are overlapping in a space and they don't necessarily want to be in the same space with each other, which sounds kind of cruel in a way, but that's essential. That's how you get mixity, that's how you get awareness, and that's how you get community. In virtual architecture, we have too much control to dictate who we see and don't see. That mixity and awareness of other people and other cultures only happens by our own discretion, which it tends to be that as human beings, we choose the easy route and not the public space route because it's messy. I hope that makes sense, but that's roughly it. Again, we have an episode on that. We're kind of deep dive.
Yeah, I think we can like go into that episode to go deeper into the conversation. Okay, I think we can move on to the next question. Actually, hi David and Marina. I have a question, but by Izian, what is your opinion when the student feels that he or she has achieved the satisfaction on the final outcome of their design thesis, yet for some others, they feel that he or she has not reached to the certain level of their satisfaction? So,
wait, so is it that the student is satisfied, but let's say their peers and critics and teachers are not?
yeah. I think.
Well,
Who's the student that asked that question? What does your project look like?
Yeah, I think she can.
That's a good
There she is.
question. We were actually talking about that before we jumped on. And I told David, I was like, I think after you're done with your thesis project, you should not be satisfied. If you're satisfied with it, that means you didn't do enough. Like something's wrong, right? You didn't do as much as you should have. You didn't push yourself as hard as you should have. If you're happy, it's great. Like being happy is a good feeling. But was that the goal? Was it to just be satisfied with what you did, or just maybe push yourself one or two steps further and see how, like, what you could do? Like, what are your limits?
I think. Well, I tend to, Marina said that you should enjoy the process, and she's correct. I tend to work in a much more tortured way, and certainly thesis for me was really, really not easy, and design is not easy for me. So I would generally I would agree with Marina and her last statement that you should never be satisfied, and not because you're not proud of the work. That's not it at all. It's just the fact that, again, you're always leaving that door slightly open. The door to the possibility, the openness to that there's a better solution out there, possibly. Now, that's kind of a weird thing in a sense because, I think when you're talking to clients, it's quite a bizarre idea that you would hire someone and pay them a lot of money. Meanwhile, they're not confident in what they're doing. But I think to be an artist or a creative, that's probably what it means.
Well, if you're not satisfied too, it means like you're always seeking to learn more, to perfect yourself. And if you're satisfied, they also, I think you should wonder, like, okay, well, let's say if that project was for a client, I'm satisfied, but the client necessarily isn't. Is that my goal? Is the goal to satisfy myself as a designer, or is my goal to satisfy the people who come to me to create something for them, right?
So two last comments on this for me is that I think the biggest struggle for designers is to fight the human tendency to want answers. And I think Marina mentioned this during the talk. And it's the biggest struggle for should you want to get that? For everyone, but especially younger students. So like a common question I will get from younger students is like, but how do I do this? Or what do I do? What do I do? And I'm always like, it's up to you to figure out, because there's looking for answers, right? And it's that willingness to always be slightly lost. Someone had once told me that design is like you're floating at sea, you're in the middle of the ocean, right? But you're surviving because you're on this piece of scrap wood. So you're afloat, you're alive. And then someone says, hey, just over there, beyond the horizon, it's right over there, you can swim toward it, but you can't see it. There's a bigger piece of debris, of a boat, in fact, you can get to, but you can't see it. And design is the act of always seeking out that better solution, even though you don't know where it is and you don't know if it actually exists. Again, that probably goes back to my tortured way of doing things. But I think that's partially accurate. The other scenario that might be the case for the student is that if you feel like you're trying to communicate a certain thing, and that's the essence of your project, and you feel like you've done that or you're close to it, meanwhile you have other people continually asking about these other things from the list of 6, and you're like, yeah, but that's not. I don't care about that so much for this project, right? The focus is this. That is entirely different from all the stuff I just said, and that is again where you really need to know what your big statement, your why am I doing this? And it's perfectly okay to know that for this project I have a focus, and by default that focus is not going to be focused on everything. It can't be. I don't know if that's the case for this individual, but that's quite common as well.
Yeah, I think it's common for everyone. I think all of us went through that during our presentation or during our process design. I think moving on to the next question. I think someone in the audience has a question.
Hey guys.
Anyone?
Amazing talk.
Okay.
So I have a question. I think it relates somewhat to when you said about the blur and focus. So in your own design process or the schools that you guys teach, or David teaches, right? Is there an incorporation of established architectural theories or other philosophies in the design process? If so, what is the degree of that incorporation?
Is that question still related to the blur and focus, or mainly is there an established pedagogy?
I'm not really sure, but for our syllabus, there's some. I wouldn't say it's so strict, but there's definitely an emphasis of using grounded theories, architectural theories established by other famous architects, and we sort of have to incorporate those theories into our design. So is that a similar case over there, or is it similar to how you guys design?
That's a two-part question. That's a great question. The States is difficult because all the schools are so different from each other. You have very theoretical schools and very practical schools, and you get everything in between. There tends to be 2 teaching philosophies, from my view. One is that there's teaching where you learn design tacitly, which is to say you do go through a series of design exercises, and through those exercises you're picking up skills, right? And in some cases it's like, okay, you're going to design this thing in the manner of this other architect, right? Or you're going to design this thing based on this other architect's way of doing things. And that's a perfectly valid way of teaching. The issue that I always had when I was a student is that I would go through that process, but no one ever told me that this is an exercise and it's just an exercise and I'm just picking up skill sets. And I don't think that's told very often. So as a result, a lot of times students have a course that's like that. It's totally valid, but they think that this is capital I, this is the way to design, and this is what I'm going to be doing, right? So I think that's not true. Not to go against what other people believe, but I don't think that's correct. I think those are just skill sets you pick up, because eventually you're going to be on your own. So in the most extreme, right, you have a course where, I've seen like students, they start with like a Coke can and then they put it in 3D and then they cut the Coke can in half and do all this stuff. And then after 3 weeks of doing that, the teacher says, okay, now this is a school, make it into a school. And students most of them are just really confused. They're like, is this how people design buildings?
Yes, it is.
Well, the answer is potentially, if you want to go that route, but generally, no, it's not the route. It's up to you to figure out. So that's like the exercise method of teaching, which is particularly productive for younger students. The other way of teaching, which I tend to favor, especially for older students, is more like, here is the site, the program, go. Well, what components of the program are there? Okay, here are the general components. What I expect you to fully question each of those components, redefine them, and add new things. That's more like the blank page approach to design, because you have to know how to do it on your own. When you graduate, no one's telling you the steps. There's no Coke can to start from. There's nothing. You have to figure out on your own, what do I really believe in as the process? Which is why as at this point, at least for us, it's less about steps and more about there's these tests, just different ways to understand things. And ideally, the solution will kind of be an arrow going straight all through all the different tests and whatnot. But yeah, I think the blank page approach is more productive because it forces people to just start and to not be afraid to try something. So one of the patterns I see in the United States is that there's schools that are too heavily focused on the exercise way of doing things, and produces students who are senior students and they are afraid to do anything without being told what to do, which in my view is a problem, right? On the other hand, you have students who maybe are more trained, or they've been thrown into the deep end. They're not afraid to just try and fail and do it again and again. So the United States is all over the place, and those are their two spectrums. As far as what we do in our process, do you want to get to that maybe? No. Why not?
No, I mean, in France, it's the same
Yeah.
thing, like learning techniques based on, like another architect or even artist. Like, I think that's a very art school approach to learning techniques, especially. Like, you're all gonna do a self-portrait at Picasso style, or to understand like what techniques and what angles and the strategies behind it. But those are just means, like technical means to get to a point. They don't teach you how you got to that point necessarily. So yeah, I would agree with you on that.
The process also, I like the idea that there's no step-by-step, because that means well, I mean, again, first you have to do research. You have to know all of the facts and be responsible about it. But I like the idea that I could be inspired by a detail, inspired by a material, be inspired by the wind. I could be inspired by the program. And that seed can be placed anywhere at the beginning. And I don't have to say that I have to do it this way or the other way. And again, knowing eventually all these various things are going to be folded into the final design.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
But,
sort of.
I'm more interested on. Okay, what you said makes sense, and thank you. But I think what my question was inquiring on the importance, like Marina said, practicing what other architects have done for so many years. So, I mean, is it still valid in the current discourse of architecture by employing the techniques and theories of other architects into your own design process? Say, Cedric Price's non-plan, or I don't know, Kenneth Frampton's critical regionalism. I mean, is it still? I mean, how far do you want to take another architect's understanding and theories into your own design process? I think
that's the thing. Yeah, I think the most important part is for you to understand how they got to this point, what led them to it, how the fact that they use those points into their architecture made the architecture one way or the other. And that's where case studies are very important, in the sense that you're doing research based on a project or a technique or a philosophy that someone else had, right? But it's always, to me personally, on project and design, a process of how do you make it your own? You can't just take someone else's principles that they built from zero, plug it in your project. Like, it has to find its own foundation and origin in your project. That makes sense.
I think it's a really good question, actually. I think for me, it's the answer is much more personal than one may believe. I don't think that the answer has so much to do with whether or not these other architects' methods or their designs were valid. I don't think validity has anything to do with it. I think it has to do with sincerity of whether or not you really believe that that's the best that you could be doing. Which it sounds kind of wishy-washy, but I think that's the case. The problem I have when someone, let's say, goes to work at an office, let's say like Zaha Hadid, right? With very definable kind of architect. And then afterwards, their work looks like all of Zaha Hadid's work, although typically not as beautiful as Hadid's work. But when that happens, I can understand that as a human, it's easy to be enamored with an individual as successful as Hadid, and it's easy to be to kind of fall in love with them and their process, and it's easy to realize that they've come across something, and that well is so deep, I could just keep going down that forever, and I might not even get as deep as them, but I know that they're successful, that their work seems to be regarded as good, at least by some, and if I go down that path, that I'm kind of guaranteed a certain level of success. And that, for me, that's the real problem, because you've basically closed off the potential that you, as a very different human being, very likely, are able to produce something in a different way. So I don't have a problem with, I don't think there's any problem at all with using other ways of doing things in terms of the solution. Like the solution could be valid. I have a problem with it because it limits the potential that you as a person could create something much better, in fact, because I think that's always the potential. And I think that a lot of the architects that we study are really well known for one or two things, but in the end, there's a lot of flaws. Like they just choose to ignore a lot of the questions that have to be asked with architecture, right? Which is to their strength. Again, they had their story, they had their intent, they had their concept, their thesis, but perhaps sometimes too much at the expense of other things that we need to be aware of as like realistic designers who build things for people. So yeah, I think the personal sacrifice you make is very dangerous for me.
Yeah, thank you for that. Very illuminating.
Okay. Thank you for the question, Landi. Is there anyone else out there?
Hi, hello.
Yeah, okay.
Hi. You guys hear me?
Yep.
Hi. Hey guys. I'm Ash, from a third semester student of the master's program here at UITM. So first and foremost, I'd just like to say that that was a surreal experience for me personally, just because of the fact I felt like I was watching a podcast halfway through, then realizing that I was actually a part of it, and then like, oh my god, just how you guys were bouncing ideas back and forth were just incredible for me, honestly.
I do have to say, I'll be honest, and Marina will probably confirm this, that so we had prepared some notes and things like that. Like we, in terms of flow, you know, once the two of us in this room and it's the podcast, we flow pretty well. Right. That was not easy. It's so awkward because we don't really refer to notes during the podcast, but now we're looking at notes and this and that. So I hope it made sense because
yeah, I mean, well, I hope so too for the most of us, at least for me personally, that was clear as water for me. But anyways, I was just mentioning that just because I think for us students, especially when we don't really, most of us, or maybe not even all of us, we don't really converse primarily in English as much. So like when transferring ideas back and forth through conversation, is like when seeing you guys do that, I think is like eye-opening for us, especially when we're experiencing it firsthand here. So first and foremost, thanks for that. But then on to my question. I actually wanted to ask something quite similar to what Elandi asked beforehand, but then I'll delve into something else just for the purpose of asking a different question. So I kind of wanted to delve into your foundations or philosophies as to how you guys started this in the first place, or as to why you guys are doing what you guys are doing now, you know, like, and how you guys are actually able to do it. Like, maybe it's just confidence, maybe it's just through pure interest, you know, just in terms of everything, in terms of the podcast, in terms of architecture in itself. And then also when it comes down to initiating projects, do you guys like have like a specific structure in how you guys tackle projects, or are you guys more impromptu in terms of like, and depending on what the project is, we'll go based on that rather than, you know, relying on a consistent formula that you guys have like maybe seen, you know, like it's been. So yeah, that's basically my question.
You want to go?
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, to answer the second question first. So again, I think it's worthwhile saying that the presentation, the discussion that we kind of had, was again focused on unbuilt works. When it comes to built works and we work with the client, the process is super structured, which sounds contradictory, but
because it involves money and time, obviously.
It's structured in the sense that we go through the standard practice phases of, like, concept design, schematic design, DD, CD, and then building. Like, right. There's much more structure in that sense. Also, when we work with a client, something that we do, which a lot of offices do, but not all of them, or at least they're not explicit about it, we have a very particular, like, step-by-step thing that a journey that we go along with the client for the client's benefit. And it begins with a step where it's essentially research, although it's called something else, where we learn as much as possible about all the fixed variables, like I said, the site, the building and the zoning code, building code, budget, all those things. You have to know that really well. And then doing an in-depth research of the client. So we'll have very long conversations with them, actually several conversations with them, to understand who they are as a person and what their goals are and what their kind of tastes are. And then we begin the process by producing sketches and going back and forth and et cetera. And so in terms of practice, we have that component, which is a little bit unique. And then we have other things too. So like so we do schematic design, which you're all familiar with. Before we go on to design development, we insert a special phase, which is, we call it the custom design realization strategy, which is basically preparation for design development. And because we have seen very often that in schematic design, a building looks super interesting, right? It's selling you this big promise, and clients are super sold by it, like it's amazing rendering or whatever. And then when you go through DD, which is when the thing becomes like real, you end up with a building that's quite boring, right? So in terms of like our own process and the everyday of like the actual office, those are some of the steps we have,
and those are kind of tied back to the concept of honesty, right? We want a very honest relationship with our clients from the beginning, because we want to give them the project that is best for them. And by looking at the custom realization strategy, it's really like what is the most important for them, and how can we make sure we preserve that throughout the development of the project.
But in an odd way, part of the presentation that we gave is the same thing we tell to clients, because it's really important for us that the clients understand that we are developing this big design statement. That's the term that we use because it's easy to understand. And we draw analogies. We say this design statement is like the big idea behind a brand. It's the thesis behind a project. It's the moral behind a story, right? And it's really important for them to get that that's what we're doing. And we tell them not everything is going to fit within the story that we're telling, right? Because clients, like designers, have all these different ideas. And it's not all going to fit. It just won't. If you want to create something that actually has a statement, which is one of the biggest objectives and the hard thing to do, you can't allow yourself to be wrongfully pulled in 100 different directions. So in a weird way, a lot of what we said actually is like lessons that we tell clients.
And then for the first part of the question, you asked how are we doing all of this? I think it's mostly practice, right? Like, we both graduated from school and then moved to New York, work in a bunch of different places, a bunch of different firms on a ton of different projects and offices. And all of that is just experience. You just accumulate confidence and knowledge, and you just build and build and build on top of all of that. And the podcast is the same thing. We started on our kitchen island back in Brooklyn, just the two of us with pseudonyms. And now we're using our faces, our real name. We have 200 episodes and more. And we're good at it now, or at least better than when we started, because we had that practice and just kept going and pushing the limit and never be satisfied with just being happy with what we could do. What could we do more, right? That's always mojo.
Yeah. For me, I mean, anyone who's listened to the show for a period of time, you kind of know that the podcast is probably more my design baby than Marina's.
Oh, that's his baby.
And I'm the one who had the idea of it, and I'm the one who forced it on her and said, "Here's a mic, talking to it. Let's go." There's a lot of reasons why I wanted to start it, but one of the biggest ones is that I always felt like I had a lot of these ideas about design, about teaching, about education, about clients, about all these things. And it was really difficult to express them because I never felt like I had the opportunity to. Either because in school, as a tortured student who was quite, anti-establishment, I just didn't have any faith in my teachers. And I had all these questions and ideas, and I was like, yeah, but I have these questions, you never answer them. And when I ask them, no one seems to have any interest in it. And I think that's not right. And so the podcast, quite frankly, was a way for me to just get that stuff out there, to talk through it as a way to just express oneself. And then hopefully, if people ended up listening, which they did, to see what people thought about it. Like, am I crazy? Are these ideas nuts? I don't know. I don't think they are. And that was a really big thing. And I mean, there's other things too. Like, I love talking.
Well, that, and also we're fortunate that we have each other to do that. And if we were individuals each on our side of the world, like, I don't know that we would be, and we would have done everything we've done so far. So, like the friends and the people you connect with and the people who think like you or that you can have good exchange are super important people, because you can help each other grow in the way you want to go to. And I think that's something that I maybe didn't realize as much when I was in school. And I do more now because of being with David. But you don't necessarily have to be dating someone else from the school, right? You can have just very close friends and do projects with them and initiate things that you are both or more interested in.
Yeah. Does that answer?
Does that make sense?
Is there any other questions?
Yeah. That's basically it. It's just that, because I feel like, especially in our era where I think there's so many talented people and skilled people in the world, no matter the place. But then the thing that some people lack is just the confidence to do them. And then just because they're scared or unsure of how it might turn out. So yeah. So basically, yeah, that was basically my question. Thanks a lot, David and Marina. Yeah.
The fear thing, I'll say real quick. I think everyone has a right to be afraid. That makes total sense. It's also why we used fake names in the beginning. Like, it's not like we started off the way we are now. Like, no one knew who we were. We didn't tell anyone about the podcast, which doesn't make sense if you're going to start a podcast. Like, no one knew about it. But it gave us that freedom, and it gave us that space away from the fear. For people who are not going to start anonymously, I would say that the one thing we've realized is that no one gives a fuck about you. like in the big scheme of things, you're nobody. Like, we're nobodies. Like, unless you're a president or you're an A-list Hollywood actor, no one cares. So
take risk.
If we upset a few people, like, again, what difference does that make in the grand scheme of the universe?
but always everything we do, and even particularly in the podcast production, if you have an idea, you also have to always question why you're doing it, right? I mean, right now there's so many podcasts out there. Like, how many of them are actually bringing any value to the table? Like, it's good to have initiatives and have projects and have ideas, but you should also kind of criticize yourself and your ideas. And what does that do? What's your goal? Super high expectation.
All right, thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Ash, for the question. Building up from the podcasting, I think I too have some of my friends. We do have an idea of trying to set up our own podcast about these things, but then we got afraid. We have goosebumps, and then we said to ourselves, what if people don't agree with us? Like, what happens if they don't agree? And then what if they say that what we talked about is very wrong? And then so we were so afraid of trying to start a podcast. But then I think the way that you guys your chemistry between each other is inspiring. So I think it inspired me to, okay, I think if they can do it, I can do it too. So
Yeah, that's absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and the truth is, you won't be able to please everyone, and you shouldn't strive to please everyone. There's always people who are going to disagree, and that's what it is. You just have to be ready for that. That's all.
Yeah, I guess so. But that's the thing. Like when we during crit session or doing review, we're trying to please everyone. We're trying to please all the aspects of sustainability and everything. I think it's embedded in our heads, and we have to do that because if we manage and successfully we successfully please everyone, that means the project is a successful project. So I think it's very hard to break away from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, that makes sense. I mean, you have to listen to everybody, and you have to. That's the challenging thing too, is that you're not going to please everyone. You have to live with that, and you have to realize that, you know, hey, what this person is saying, that doesn't make any sense at all. But you still have to think about it, right? Because there might be some new sliver of a perspective that you just don't know.
And you're a student too, so you actually have way more freedom to do certain things that you would in real life, and I think you should remember that in a way, right? Like, you know, like one time I had a project, I think in 4th year, and I came up with it to the teacher with, you know, 2 of my close friends, and we're like, hey, you know what? We don't agree with the project that's being presented. This is what we're thinking we should be doing, and we propose a whole agenda. We, you know, like we came up with something, and the teacher was like, okay, that sounds good. There is room for negotiation as a student that you have that's much greater than doing a real project with a real client that's being built. And I think sometimes you should remember that and you know, use it.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, not to cut you off, I was going to ask, and Landy had initially put down that there was a question about aesthetics, I think, and technical aspects of architecture. And we thought about that quite a bit, actually, and we're actually a little confused by it because it can mean a lot of things. So we're wondering, where did that question come from?
Oh, Ilandi, you can. Yeah, I think I think it came from him. Ilandi.
Can I actually, because I was the one who asked the question. It's actually how do you balance aesthetic and function? Because as students, you want to address our identity, but there's always these regulations and technicalities that restrains our process of creating that identity, and the whole purpose is not trying to let our design to just be another building.
Sorry, before you guys answer, just so you guys know, she's a huge proponent of Mark Forster Gage. So just.
Oh my God. Okay. Yeah, I do listen to his talks or read his book because that's a part of my dissertation and also my thesis.
Marina, do you know who that is?
Who was it?
Mark Forster Gage. Yeah, 1 second. But he's primarily known for, but that's a specific project. He does installations a lot, right?
Yeah. He does installations, and he's actually the dean of Yale School of Architecture, I think. I think, and he writes on object-oriented ontology. I think it's a philosophy that they actually talk about there. So I'm not sure, but my question is basically aesthetic versus function.
Yeah. Well, if this person's work, Mark's work is a reference, then we have a pretty big leap. I can see where the question comes from then. I tend to think that work like his, and I'm not super familiar with it, so I don't want to judge it at kind of face value. He's probably not asking enough questions to himself to truly call himself an architect. I think the reality is that, like, you know, at the end of the day, like, we know what the core questions that face architecture are, and actually they're probably very close to the ones we wrote down, the 6, right? Like, we know those are there. It's just that I think what we're striving for is capital A architecture. And capital A architecture is successful in most of those criteria that we mentioned, but it still has a spirit to it. And I think that in like I said, you have to sacrifice certain elements to really make the other parts work or make the idea work. I think that's the case. I think that idea becomes even more clear the more you sacrifice. But at some point, when you sacrifice too much, in my personal view, it's no longer architecture. It's simply architectural research, or arts, you could even call it. Like there's certain components to the function of architecture that has to exist for it to be legitimately called architecture. That's not to say that architectural research, like PS1 installations and whatnot, that's not to say they're not worth anything or they're not valid. They're 100% valid. We absolutely need it. But in terms of syntax, can we call it architecture? A bit of a stretch.
Well, and that's because, like you're questioning, right? There is the kind of the two opposite end of the spectrum. There is the function and there is the aesthetic, like what's pretty versus what's useful. Do we have to choose between the two? No, it really should be a balance of trying to merge the two. We want things that are beautiful and we want things that are, functional and practical. The problem I would have with buildings like this is that if you strip down all the frosting, what's left? That's really the core foundation of what we experience as users, right? Like, what is the quality of the space? How do I feel in it? Like, what are the views? Like, what is this building doing that another building wouldn't? And a lot of times, buildings that are so aesthetically expressive, they're kind of camouflaged their weakness in a way, right? So, I don't know his work enough to, be saying that for all of his work, but, what is what's the core of his building? Is it his signature, his aesthetic signature? Is it his core principle and what he's trying to do with the project? Is aesthetic signature differs depending on where the project is located, or is it just a gesture that a painter would have for any of their paintings, right?
I think I was at a critique one time, and you guys might know Jimenez Lai of Bureau Spectacular. He was on the panel, and the project was an urban design. Was it? Well, architecture and urban design-ish, right? And it was in a studio where students, again, they started with like some objects, they did like formal stuff and they collaged it and whatever, and then there's the projects. And this person presenting is like, this is my urban design proposal for, might have been Malaysia, I don't know. But anyway, this urban design proposal. And it was totally abstract. And in terms of function, it was like, there's no way this would ever work. Like, how do you fit people in this? Like, where's the transportation? Like, all the things, the 5 essential components of urban design had totally missing. And Jimenez had brought up the point at the very beginning. He said, we could talk about this project in different ways. The first, if I can remember, the first is we could talk about it as urban design. And it says, if we do that, this project sucks. It's a total failure. You get whatever. It's not urban design, right? If we talk about it in terms of formal process and how you got there, well, then there's some interesting things that we can talk about that. And the third one, I don't remember what it was, but the point was that he was clearly from the beginning of the critique saying, okay, we could talk about it these 3 ways. Which way we're going to talk about it? Because we can't, because again, like I've said on the podcast, like, what is the student trying to do, right? The critique is always based on what the student's trying to do. And that statement is valid, right? The student wasn't focused on urban design issues. That's valid. I mean, it shows that they're able to work through a certain process. However, at some point in your career, as an older student or as a practicing person, you need to say to yourself, okay, when am I gonna like finally give up on the filtering out of variables because it makes it easier for me to focus on what I want to focus on. When in reality, for a public piece of architecture that is used by people, there's a bunch of factors that we have to consider, and you can't just ignore them. Personally, for me, I tend to be more interested and more focused on less the formal, in the spectrum of this conversation being kind of like Mark's work, and more on the people in the program. That I personally find that more interesting. The last thing I'll say, which could be used as an argument, I believe, to say that hyper focus on form is important, is the reality that the way we use buildings and spaces is actually very detached from the form. Similar to the restaurant analogy I gave, right? The restaurant's designed to dictate certain behavior, but I can do whatever I want. What difference does it make to me if the room is circular or square or with squiggly line if I'm eating dinner? Not much, really. And buildings a lot of times have life well after their initial program. So in that way, to hell with program, to hell with all of that, right? It's just about creating something beautiful because that's what's going to last. And also, that's the most, one could argue, one of the most important factors of a physical structure anyway.
Yeah, the only danger with that is that a lot of time I feel like, especially more contemporary architect and the technologies that are available to us in the construction field, is that they're too focused on making it a monument and not so much capital A architecture, which capital A architecture isn't necessarily a monument. You know, people are going to decide if it's going to be a piece of history in architecture or a symbol in a city, right? Like you, the architect, the author, shouldn't be the one dictating that. And that's kind of my issue with buildings that are sometimes a little too much about the aesthetics. It's that they're too egocentric. They're not really, you know, relating to what's around and giving room and space for the other buildings to exist. They're just kind of like squishing them down and, you know, putting their big footprint in the space that they're occupying. So
the very last thing I'll say with this before we end or whatever is that I think also, I'm not talking about you, the individual who asked the question, but in general, sometimes I think designers think that, again, like program is not going to yield interesting form and research of program and site is not going to yield interesting form. But again, if the research of everything, including program, is actually done well and conceptually, you will find something interesting and it'll be interesting because it's not based on a preconception, right? Like when you realize that the program should change dramatically and you should start including things that make no sense on the face of it, right? Then that yields very interesting solutions and very often very interesting form. It might not be the form that you have come to the project with that you're interested in, like your own biases again, but it is nonetheless going to be provocative.
Yeah, that answers it, I guess. Thank you.
Sorry, yeah, thank you, Balkish, for the question. I mean, are you guys, we have one more question actually. I think this will be the last question in the chat box. I think it would be, because he posted since 11 a.m. just now. He said, Lukman said, you guys mentioned earlier about the core in design. Can you elaborate more about this core, the idea of core, from which aspect of variable parameter does it really derive to make an absolute good core in design?
Wait, sorry, say that last part again?
From which aspect of variable parameter does it really derive to make an absolute good core in design?
Oh, wait, here, I'm going to pull it up on this screen.
Yeah, you can check the chat box. The last question.
I mean, like which like founding principles of the design really matters.
Yeah, I think that's the way that he's trying to approach the question. Yeah.
Well, I think each project is different, right? And you are the one who have to define what those principles are. They might not be identical for all of the projects.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's a good question. It's a tough question. And sometimes with these conversations, I worry it's difficult without a project in front of us. But I think that so like in the previous kind of chat, we were kind of critiquing that if you focus too much on formal and not other things, that maybe it's very successful and actually has a very strong core, but that core in fact is so narrow focused that it's not considered architecture. That's one way to look at the conversation. I think when you found the core, so the core of the solution, when it addresses a bunch of stuff cleanly, that's kind of elusive and difficult to get your mind around of. But like In some ways, like the more, if you have this answer and it addresses form, it addresses program, it addresses site, addresses whatever else, then you know it's good. In the same way, well, here's an analogy to urban design or architecture even. When I'm designing a building in the middle of a city context, so we're not talking about a building in the middle of the desert or a mountainside. I'm talking about a building in the middle of a city context, and there's a bunch of program and other things around it, right? And I'm designing, I don't know, a community center or a gym, something kind of generic, right? One of the things that we talk about in the urban design courses is that the success is the idea that that building is merely a component within a larger system, the system being the city. And the success of that building is its ability to integrate and further the character of the city that's around it, right? Which, less abstractly in terms of program, means that if I was told this is a gym and I put in gym stuff and I don't think about program any further than that, I've probably failed. If I do research of everything around the land use and the program and the restaurants and whatever else around my site, and I realize that there's a school nearby and I can incorporate some kind of like, was it nursery or like place to take care of kids or something into the gym program and other things, the better that program is. So in terms of having a core program, let's say, the more that your program can kind of not just be alone successful, but integrate and draw ties and connection and webs to a bunch of stuff around it, the better. Another example would be that in one of the studios that I had taught, the students had to have some kind of installation happen at this park. I call it an installation because it's undefined. It could be a building, it could be a park, it could be a swimming pool, whatever. Do something there, some kind of intervention, rather. And one of the students, and so all the students did different research and ultimately came to different conclusions. And one of them found that there's a bunch of schools right nearby this giant park, really close, public schools for kids. But none of these schools had playgrounds because they didn't have space for it on the site. So he turned the park into a space that flipped from public to private meaning for the schools. So sometimes it's public for everybody, other times it flips and becomes a giant playground for all the students. Now, the core or the success of that design has to do with the fact that it's solving an issue that's present and it's reaching out to the city around it. I hope that's clear. And if it is clear, then the same thinking applies to the concept of whatever your design is. If your concept is able to, again, be an arrow that addresses the questions of form, addresses the questions of all the other things I listed, then you know you're onto something. If your concept or your design is really only addressing one of those things, then that's not it. You've got to figure out a way to incorporate other elements. I don't know, Marina, what do you think?
Yeah. It's a complex question. It's a very complex question. I mean, it's really like, what is the meaning, what is the value?
I think also it's when the core of the design or the concept, when it clearly outlines what the building should be, then you know it's right, which is kind of crappy because it's kind of like this thing of you know when it happens, but it's definitely the case. I'm thinking back to like a project that I did. Well, this is an old project, but like I had to design a homeless shelter, right? And there's a lot of ways to design a homeless shelter. And students in the studio, this was for a studio, and there's a lot of factors with that. You have to have shelter, obviously. You have to have food provided. There's issues of security. There's issues of sanitation, all of these things. And some of the students like hyper-focused on security, which is super important in a homeless shelter. But their concept was just about that. And as a result, they effectively designed a prison, this donut form with a bunch of like windows. It was like kind of terrible. But right, they like their solution, perfect sense if you're only concerned about security. But probably that's not a great core to have for a homeless shelter. For me at that time, I had realized that a homeless shelter is not just a place to temporarily keep people, and it's not a place just to keep them safe either, but in fact, it's a place to rehabilitate them so they can eventually become citizens back into normal society. And that led me down a path of thinking, well, if this is really just a step in the process, then wouldn't it be great if this homeless shelter was, instead of thought as a shelter or a place to keep people safe and healthy, it's thought of a place where they can practice being normal citizens in the real world. Because their lives currently as being homeless is very different. They don't have a home, obviously. They all their activities are in public, right? They have no privacy. The threshold from public to private doesn't exist. So it became very clear to me, well, I'm going to create basically a microcosm of a town. And there's going to be private areas where they're sleeping, obviously, and they're going to be very far away from the public areas. I'm going to have public spaces which mimic the forms of the classic American public spaces with a courtyard kind of things. I'm going to have places where they can eat, places where they can get food, but it's not going to be a cafeteria. They're going to be lined like shops. So this whole thing was designed to kind of create a microcosm of what they would experience in real life so they could practice going through the routine of having public and private separation, practice being in public spaces in a certain way, and practice going getting food. So that's kind of an example, but see, the idea that the shelter was a stepping stone and the idea that the shelter could become this practice ground was the core for that project. And I know it's the core because it addressed the key issues of the people involved, and it led to building form to a certain degree. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think it answers the question. All right. I guess that was the last question from all of us. Actually, we have a lot, but then I think we can post it on your podcast maybe. Because there's a lot of
yeah, we have a hotline.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whatever questions you have, sent to us.
Yeah. So usually at the end of the talk, we would like to have a screenshot of all our faces online. So yeah, just like, just a typical conventional way of trying to celebrate our session. Okay, I think everyone can turn on their cameras. We try to have one picture. Okay. All right, thank you. Okay, style you want, freestyle, you smile, or can be anything. All right. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Yeah, we'll send you the pictures.
Cool.
Yeah, please do.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do want to say thank you to you guys. This has been quite tremendous. Again, I hope it was helpful. It's bizarre and new to us to speak to a big number of people like this. It's difficult because we can't really quite read the crowd as well. But it's been a pleasure, and you guys have forced us to think about things. So if you listen to the podcast, you're probably going to hear a lot of these things in the next few episodes. Yeah.
And of course, we like to thank you guys so much for spending the time, taking your time, spending time with us, and having this talk. It's very detailed, very eye-opener, and then I think it's a great exposure for all of us to have to dwell in your guys, dwell the world of architecture from your perspective. And I believe, I think that's about it. Right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Best of luck
so
with the rest of the semester and thesis and everything else that people are doing, and stay in touch.
All right, will do. Okay, thank you so much, David.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks so
Okay,
much.
Guys,
Bye.
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 Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jaja.
Yeah. Thank you, Miss K.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining the session. Thank you for making it happen. You guys can adjourn now.